If you've ever traveled through Northwest Ohio, you were probably struck by how flat the land is here and how intensively farmed the place is. Night and day, around the clock, never seeming to relax when the growing season is upon us. This is some of the richest, most productive farmland in the country. What's astonishing is that not long ago, less than 100 years ago, this place was an abysmal, human-forsaken swamp. So heavily forested with giant oak, elm, hickory, sycamore, cottonwood, ash, and maple that you couldn't see the light of day here during the summer months. Underwater in all except the driest months of the year, and even then, water filled your footsteps as you walked. Infested with mosquitoes, gnats, horseflies, crawling with snakes, moccasins, water rats, and prowled by ravaging wolves and wildcats. No wonder the first white people who saw the place called it the Great Black Swamp. The only wonder is how they ever got up enough nerve to settle here, and then to transform the place so radically into this fertile, vast expanse. It was a heroic conquest, one a few people know about, yet should know about, because it makes all this flatness take on some much-needed meaning and character. The people here treated the Great Black Swamp as though it were the enemy, and they annihilated it. And the swamp, in turn, took a part of the soul of everyone who touched it. Hello, I'm Glenn Colwriter. Let me tell you the story about the Great Black Swamp of Northwest Ohio. Here near Eagleville Road in southern Wood County, one can stand on the edge of the old swamp, look into it, and gain some sense of its geological origins. The land to the north of us here is about 10 feet lower than the land to the south. What we're looking at is the bed of an ancient lake that covered the area, and we're standing on its beach, as the sand testifies. The lake was a residue of a great glacier that covered northwest Ohio during the Ice Age 20,000 years ago. As the ice mass receded to the northeast, it left behind it ridges of pebbles and stones called moraines that blocked the flow of water to the northeast, causing rivers and lakes to form on the western side of the moraines and drain to the southwest through the Wabash Valley into the Mississippi Valley. When the glacier completely dissipated, leaving Lake Erie in its wake, the general drainage of the area shifted into Lake Erie, following highly circuitous routes caused by the blocking action of the glacial moraines and the beaches of the old glacial lakes. The result was a vast flooded plain that eventually became a heavily forested swamp. To the best of our knowledge, no human ever lived beyond this point inside the swamp until early in the 19th century. Indians who settled in this area set up their villages on the high, drier ground outside the swamp. When whites moved into the area, they too stayed on the periphery, often settling on the sites of the former Indian villages. In fact, you can draw a rather exact map of the old swamp by simply drawing a line that connects the major towns of northwest Ohio. The line would also reveal where the old major roads were, like this Sand Ridge Road that people followed in order to get around the swamp on their trek westward. Those people who happened, for one reason or another, to venture into the swamp gave it a dirty name, telling horror story after horror story and swearing they'd never go back. Stories about traveling on horseback constantly in water up to the saddle blankets, about biting flies and mosquitoes that left the horses ribboned with blood and the riders driven mad with welts and itching. Stories about getting lost almost immediately in the dark woods and trying to find one's way out. About the black oozing mud that seemed to have no bottom, creating fears that people would sink out of sight in one of those devil's holes. And about tangles of fallen timber, blown askew by centuries of tornadoes, so mangled and intertwined that you could become ensnared in them and have to hack your way out, crawling in the slimy mud in many places. It was here, in what was then a tangle of fallen timbers, on the northern very edge of the swamp, that General Mad Anthony Wayne defeated the local Indian tribes in 1794. A defeat that opened this part of the Northwest Territory to white settlement free of Indian harassment. In return, in the treaty that followed, we gave the Indians a reserve of lands and promised them that whites would never intrude upon them there. The Black Swamp comprised a substantial part of this reserve. Well, the Indians had already demonstrated their dislike for the place, so the Black Swamp remained forsaken of human inhabitants well into the 19th century. After Ohio became a state in 1803, whites did begin to show some interest in the swamp. But they weren't interested in settling there, just in getting through the miserable place. People who wanted to settle in Michigan or in northern Indiana and parts west found the swamp an absolute obstacle to westward land travel. Thus, in 1808, the U.S. government obtained a strip of land from the Indians for the purpose of building a road directly through the swamp. This strip of land was to become the notorious Maumee Western Reserve Road, now US 20, between Perrysburg and Fremont, or Lower Sandusky as Fremont was called at that time. When the route was finally completed in 1827, you could hardly call it a road. After cutting a swath 120 feet wide through the virgin forest, the road builders pulled the stumps over to one side where they formed a kind of fence against the wilderness. The logs were pulled into a heap in the middle of the road and burned. They then scooped the mud from the sides of the swath into the middle, forming a roadbed of sorts with shallow ditches on either side where the mud had been scooped out. Less than a year after it was built, the road had become impassable, and travelers took to the ditches along the side of the road to secure better footing. By 1835, the quagmire had become known throughout the United States as the worst piece of road on the continent. Famous for its 35 inns along its 34 miles, or an inn every mile, necessary because you often couldn't make more than a mile a day through the mud. There were some reports of travelers taking 3 days to get from one inn to the next, coming back to rest each night because their wagons were engulfed in mud part way to the next inn. The people who ran these places often made more from pulling people out of the mud than they did from innkeeping. Some were accused of watering the holes in front of their inns to make sure people would bog down and stay at their places. If they did, it wasn't necessary because the poor design of the road made it certain that the mud holes would occur at regular intervals. For by throwing up the embankment of mud along the course of the road, the builders had actually dammed up the natural drainage of the swamp to the northeast, causing the swamp south of the road to drain up against the road, washing it out and undermining it. These mud holes were so deep that more than one traveler reported almost losing an entire horse in one. Another, a woman traveler, told of seeing a hat floating across one of those mud holes, but when she reached out to pick it up, a person from below shouted out, "Hey, stranger, put back my hat." Upon which she then saw a head emerge from the mud, then a body of a man, then a wagon, and a full team of horses under him, as the unfortunate traveler pulled his way out of the other side of the mud hole. Another road that was built to get people through the swamp was Hull's Trace, so named because it was originally just a path blazed through the swamp by General Hull and his men on their way to do battle at Fort Meigs during the War of 1812. Unlike the Maumee Western Reserve Road, this one cut through a part of the swamp that was characterized by prairies, oak openings, and limestone outcroppings, the whole giving a more or less open feeling compared to the blackness experienced elsewhere in the swamp. Here in Bowling Green, the only major town built within the swamp's borders, the first people to pass through here celebrated the open flatness of the place by naming the town Bowling Green. The prairies, although devoid of trees, were still inundated with water from 1 to 4 feet deep, depending on the season, with the prairie grass commonly growing 3 to 6 feet high. The oak openings occurred mostly on higher ground, on sand islands or sand ridges, remnants of the old glacial lake. The mighty white oaks, red oaks, and other bur oaks that grew on the higher lands shut out the light from other species of trees, preventing their growth, creating the openness underneath. The limestone outcroppings usually occurred in conjunction with the prairies. In fact, the reason there are so few trees on the prairies was that the bedrock limestone was so near the surface, less than a foot in some places, preventing trees from rooting. The nearness of the bedrock also prevented the prairies from absorbing much water, causing general flooding throughout the area. Thus, travelers in this area had to deal with the same problems of wetness and mud as their Maumee Western Reserve counterparts. One early attempt to solve this problem was to corduroy the road. That is, lay logs crosswise across the road, letting the mud absorb them layer after layer until a firm roadbed was established. This worked in some places, particularly where the limestone bedrock was not so far below the surface, but in other places, the mud just kept absorbing the logs as though there were no bottom to it. A half-century later, when the present US 25 was being built along the old route of Hull's Trace, workers found perfectly preserved logs buried 20 and 30 feet below the surface. In the 1850s, another attempt was made to solve the problem by planking the road. That is, by laying 1-inch thick oak planks, about 6 to 8 inches wide and 12 feet long, crosswise across the road on hefty stringers embedded in the mud, the whole affair creating a kind of boardwalk across the wet and muddy ground. Sawmills were set up at strategic points along the route to supply the planks, which were cut from locally obtained timber, especially along the oak openings. Planking the road worked well at first. People especially liked its smoothness, something unknown to travelers at the time outside of water travel. It had a major drawback, though, in that the road was not wide enough for 2 wagons to pass each other. Elaborate rules of the road were created based on what kind of freight one was carrying to determine which person would get off into the mud, an operation that usually involved unloading the wagon first to lessen the weight, then driving off, letting the other fellow pass, then struggling back onto the road out of the mud and reloading the wagon. Later on, another problem was the planks themselves, which tended to float away when the water level rose, or become scattered when a fast-moving wagon ran over them. When either of these problems occurred, the road became nearly impassable. Almost mercifully, the planks rotted within a decade, and the plank road idea was abandoned, leaving the route in worse shape, however, than it had been in the first place. A similar attempt to get over the muddy swamp, if one couldn't get through it, was made by the Ohio Railroad Company during the 1830s and 1840s. The idea was to build a continuous bridge across the swamp from Sandusky City to Maumee Bay. Since it was impossible to move heavy machinery in the swamp, a trestle was to be built with a combination steam buzzsaw and pile driver mounted on railroad tracks together with a locomotive sawmill on it. The steam apparatus in front would reach out over the end of the trestle, cut down any trees along the route. The sawmill would cut the trees up into pilings, stringers, and cross ties. The pile driver would drive pilings into the ground in front of the track as deeply as it could, then cut them off level with the track bed. The workers would then attach the stringers and cross ties, lay the additional track, and the whole operation would move out onto the newly built trestle to begin the process anew. It seemed like a good idea, and a great many investors bought into it. But after the project had been underway a while, the piling started disappearing into the mud, along with the tracks and whatever equipment was aboard. By 1845, the Ohio Railroad Company was bankrupt. The swamp had won again. Another, and for a time, somewhat successful attempt to get through the swamp was the Miami, Wabash, and Erie Canal system, begun during the 1820s. The Wabash and Erie portion of this system was begun by the state of Indiana as a means of traveling through the Black Swamp from Lake Erie to Fort Wayne and beyond. The Miami and Erie portion was instigated by commercial interests in Cincinnati and Dayton, who wanted a trade route through the swamp to Lake Erie and points east. The portions of the system lying within the swamp were the last to be built, owing to the lack of laborers and contractors willing to work in the swamp. Those who did commanded high wages and up to 32 ounces of whiskey per day, supposedly medicine for the variety of swamp diseases and maladies that workers came down with. They slept in tents, in mud with mosquitoes and snakes, isolated from family and friends. They worked almost non-stop for 13 years, gnawing away at the wilderness until the task was completed. A short 12 years later, the canal was being abandoned as uneconomical to operate. The problems were many. One was that the canal, like other water courses, froze during the winter, making travel impossible. But unlike other waterways, having no current to speak of, it froze earlier and stayed frozen longer. Another was that the canal, modeled on the Erie Canal, was only 4 feet deep with earthen sides, a combination that prevented boats from traveling more than 4 miles per hour for fear of washing the sides away. When a breakthrough did occur, either from speeding or a collision, the entire section of canal between locks would have to be closed down and drained for repairs. Add to these problems those of washouts caused by spring floods and of low water caused by summer droughts, and you'll have some idea of how impractical and unprofitable this now seemingly romantic form of travel was. During its short lifespan, though, the canal did bring a few improvements to the swamplands. Sawmills and grist mills run by water power from the canal system. Some grain elevators for collecting and shipping local grain to distant markets. An iron works run with charcoal made from local woods in beehive affairs, using the charcoal to smelt iron ore shipped in from Lake Superior via the canal. Some rip-roaring canal towns, like Junction, for example, located at the junction of the two canals, known for its many saloons and whorehouses. Aside from these exploitative ventures, the canal did little to inspire people to settle in the swamp. All of Paulding County, for example, laid within the swamp, no part of the county being more than 12 miles from the canal. And yet the county experienced practically no settlement during the canal era. The few settlements that survived the early attempts to establish travel routes through the swamp were those along sand ridges or near prairies. Places where there were natural drainage, the lack of trees, and readily available grasses for the animals gave the pioneers a chance to contend with the swamp. But even these could hardly be called settlements, for there was nothing settled about scratching out an existence with a hand hoe and a prayer to God, living in wagons, tents, and pole cabins, relying on cash from other enterprises like those trying to build a route through the swamp. Even the formation of counties in 1820 and the removal of the Indians in 1830 didn't entice people to come live here. Instead, it was a sequence of events brought on by the Ohio-Michigan War of 1835, that humorous episode in the history of states' rights that was to determine whether Toledo would be in Ohio or in the new state of Michigan. The fracas was brought on by a surveying dispute as to where the Ohio-Michigan border was. One surveyor, Harris, claimed it was north of Toledo. The other, Fulton, claimed it was south of Toledo. When Congress failed to resolve the dispute, the two governors ordered their militia to Toledo to prepare for battle. Well, the Michigan troops had an easy time reaching Toledo, but the Ohio troops had to slug through the Black Swamp, trying to move heavy artillery and battle wagons down the Maumee Western Reserve Road. They barely made it to Perrysburg, and then only after shedding their heavy equipment and supplies in the mud. Luckily, the Ohio troops never had to do battle. Before a real skirmish could take place, Congress awarded Toledo to Ohio and gave Michigan the Upper Peninsula. And President Andrew Jackson dismissed the governor of Michigan, thus dispersing his troops. But the governor of Ohio never forgot his ordeal of trying to get through the Black Swamp. Upon his return to Columbus, he ordered the General Assembly to seek ways to improve the road, and he lobbied the Congress on the necessity of an improved road as a military route, especially now that Michigan was to become a state. In 1839, legislation was passed both in Congress and in the State Assembly to macadamize and drain the road, making it fit for heavy travel. This event, when accomplished, turned things around and gave people the idea that you might be able to settle in the swamp. The engineers who redesigned the road figured out that the old design was causing the mud holes. They thus specified that deep ditches be run on both sides of the road with culverts under the road at appropriate intervals so that water draining from the south could pass under the road to the north. They then created more broad, deep ditches to lead the water away quickly to the nearest natural waterway that flowed away from the area. The roadbed itself was to be built of large ground limestone pieces at the base, followed by layer upon layer of smaller and smaller stones. The stone was to be obtained from limestone quarries set up at intervals along the road. There were no steam-driven stone crushers then, so the stone had to be crushed on the road, first by workmen and then by the wagon wheels of the first travelers on the road. They, of course, objected vociferously to the punishing ride, and many took to ditches again rather than drive on the roadbed. But as the surface of the road increased in drivability, the people began to recognize that this improved method of building the road not only kept the road usable, but it drained the surrounding area and made it inhabitable. The knowledge that the swamp could be drained and settled created an invasion of people intent upon striking it rich. Some were mere speculators, buying up land in anticipation of railroads passing through the area, creating towns and commerce. Others were exploitative industries ready to turn the natural resources of the swamp into cash in their pockets. But most were simply poor but industrious people who were ready to sacrifice their lives and their families for a piece of land and a harvest that they could call their own. They were really naive people, innocents, who had no idea what they were getting themselves into. Probably if they'd known, they'd never have come. They were shocked then when the wolves attacked their livestock and poultry, and then would snarl at the cabin door, pawing to get in, daring them to come out. Some of the earliest cabins didn't even have doors, there being no sawn lumber as yet, only quilts thrown over the opening at night. When the wolves would come, the people would build fires as large and as bright as they could in the fireplace in the hopes that the light would drive the wolves away. It usually worked, but just as often they'd stick around outside until daylight, sometimes poking their noses through any open chinking in the cabin. Another surprise was to wake up in the morning and find 2 or 3 Indians sprawled, sleeping in front of the fireplace. As soon as the sun was up, the Indians would depart, leaving as quietly as they had come in. Sometimes you'd be surprised to find them in the yard sharpening their knives on the big grindstone, laughing as they felt the new sharpness of their knives, scaring the children as they tested the knives on anything nearby. The settlers were literally stung out of their senses by horseflies, gnats, and mosquitoes. Why, the horseflies were as big as bumblebees, and they could almost knock a person down with their stings. And the gnats and mosquitoes came by the millions, sometimes in clouds. Along with the horseflies, they attacked the animals and drove them wild, so that the settlers had to cover their plow horses and oxen with blankets, head and all, even in the hottest weather, in order to keep the pests away. Humans wore long sleeves and gloves, veiling their faces and such with a kerchief. The only other defense was the smudge fire, which you carried with you when you went to milk the cow, letting the smoke blow over you while you milked, and then what you took back inside and put it under the table while you ate your dinner, and when you retired for the night, you set it near your bed so that you could sleep in a cloud of smoke. In this bewildering fog of smoke and mosquitoes, the settlers didn't even seem to notice the water that was everywhere, so much a part of their lives that they lost consciousness of it. No need to dig a well, just dig a trench near the cabin, and it will fill with water every day, enough to supply your wants. Some people got water by simply lifting a floorboard in the corner of the cabin, then reaching down and paling out whatever they needed from below. They had no idea the place would be so miserable, and that the trees would be so tall and so wide across that 1 or 2 persons couldn't possibly fell them. It would take a massive attack to clear the forest, an all-out commitment to eliminate the trees. At first, the lumbering could only take place in the winter when the ground was frozen solid. The streams in the swamp were too sluggish to float logs to market on, so they had to be carted out in sleds. When a tree was found to be hollow inside, some farmers would save the logs and use them as chicken coops or hog sties. Some of these hollow logs were apparently large enough for a person to stand up inside. Why, there's a story down in Paulding County about a man who lived in one as his house. But the fame of these trees reached all the way to Europe. And when it became possible to float logs out on the canal, a firm in Montreal sent teams of French-Canadian choppers into this area to cut down the oak trees to be sent to Europe to be used as ship's timbers. Now, to be useful for this purpose, the tree had to be white oak, at least 60 feet from the ground, up to the first branch. The choppers were known far and wide for the sharpness of their axes, razor sharp, as they would say. They came in teams of 100 or so, like an army, took the trees they wanted and moved on with a polish and flair that the locals admired and applauded. The timbers were cut into 60-foot or longer pieces, squared on 4 sides, lashed together along with lighter logs to keep them afloat, and then sent as a raft down the canal to Toledo, then by boat to Montreal, then by steamship to Europe. More commonly, however, the trees were cut up into logs for local enterprises, especially the many barrel stave factories. In such cases, the logs would be cut up into bolts from which the staves would be carved. At the factory, these would be soaked until they were saturated with water, then sliced into staves with a very sharp knife. They were then arranged in ricks to dry. Then they would be carved to fit into a barrel. Many early farmers made their only cash by working in the barrel stave factories. Some lost their hands or arms on the sharp knives that sliced the staves. Others were children whose major job was fetching the staves out of the ricks for the carvers, a task they liked to accomplish by getting on top of the rick and riding the staves down as they broke into the stack. The staves were made mostly of elm and were used in loose-fitting barrels, such as were used for flour and meat packing. The hoops for these barrels were made of hickory, carved on a shave horse with a draw shave from a hoop pole into a hoop with an eye on one end of it and a hook on the other, so that it could be hooked together over the staves. Making hoop poles was like chopping wood, something you did in your spare time. But in the swamp area, it was for many a full-time job, a kind of cottage industry that made northwestern Ohio known throughout the country as the land of pole hoop makers. Other industries that accompanied the lumbering industry were the bent wood factories that made the increasingly popular bent wood furniture, the basket makers who wove thinly sliced tulip and poplar trees into pecks and bushels, the cooper who put the staves and the hoops together with a heading into a barrel, and other woodworkers who made handles, oars, spokes, headings, and other items turned on a lathe. Perhaps the most skilled person around during this period was the millwright, the person who knew how to build things, be they mills, bridges, dams, barns, or simply houses. These were made of logs hewn with a broad axe, bored and pegged, mortised and tendoned, and fitted precisely together to the millwright's specifications. Such productive uses of the timber, however, were often too time-consuming and expensive for the war that was being waged against the forest. When there was no quick way to market the timber, the logs would be rolled up into a pile and set on fire. If there was an ashery nearby, one would collect the ashes afterwards and sell them to the potash maker for a few cents a bushel. Otherwise, it was cheaper to simply girdle the trees and let them die, burning them when they were dead enough. Or another technique that was used, called clear cutting, had you cut the tree halfway through, wait for a good windstorm, whereupon the entire forest would come crashing down, and you could then readily set it ablaze. Whatever the technique, the ultimate goal of the battle was to reduce the forest to a field of stumps. These would be aged for 4 or 5 years, that is, left in the field to rot loose while crops were raised around them. Then the dynamiter would come in to blow the stumps out. A good dynamiter could get a well-aged stump to shoot 150 feet in the air in one piece. But if the stump wasn't well enough aged, it would disintegrate, leaving shards of roots and fragmented wood to plow through for the next several years. Even with the best conditions, it took 5 to 10 years to clear a field of the trash left over. You can imagine what it was like to run into the trash with a handheld plow. I'm sure it built up your arms. Makes you kind of believe the old story about the traveler who asks a farmer in the swamp which way to town. And the farmer who is plowing absent-mindedly picks up his plow and points in the direction of town. When the field was finally cleared, it could be farmed, but still not by conventional means owing to wetness. Oxen, for example, were found to be more suitable for plowing than horses because of their raw power to pull through mud. And although oxen were regarded as unfashionable beasts of burden elsewhere, they were treated with respect in the swamp, which made them acceptable harness animals for even the most formal occasions. When horses were used in the field, they were not used in the usual 2-horse teams found elsewhere, but in troikas, or 3-horse teams, or in 4-horse teams, the additional horsepower being needed to pull the equipment through the wet ground. The immediate problem was to get rid of the water, which was done by digging shallow, open ditches around the perimeter of the field, and then deep plowing, throwing every 3rd furrow over the previous 2, so that the field was striped with surface ditches. The crops were planted in the higher ground. At first, farmers tried some crops particularly suited to wetlands like sorghum cane. Farmers near the prairies used them as hay fields, burning off the grasses in the spring, then harvesting the fresh growth as summer came on, using it to feed cattle. But most farmers stuck to the corn cultivation that the Indians had practiced, only planting more precisely in hills, created by plowing the field in a hatchwork pattern so that the dirt was thrown up into regularly spaced hills and the water would accumulate and drain around them. As soon as a farmer would find the opportunity, he would replace this crude surface draining system with an equally crude but more effective underground one. One kind involved nailing pieces of 1x6 and 1x5 together in a V, then placing the affair upside down in a ditch about 2 feet deep, creating a triangular tunnel when the dirt was filled back in. Another similar technique was to lay a sapling lengthwise across one side of a ditch, then lay a wide board over the sapling, creating a triangular tunnel. Another eliminated the sapling altogether by digging a second, narrower ditch within the first ditch, then laying the headers across it, supporting them on the side ledges. Whatever the variety of drainage system, it was always installed in the spring when the soil was wet and easily shaped while digging, but when the farmer had to work up to his hips in wet and mud. The boards for these drainage systems were cut during the late fall and through the winter and laid in place in the fields ready for next spring's ditching operation. During the summer, from June until the first freeze, the other major burden that caught the settlers by surprise was the fever and ague. Today, we'd call the disease malaria, and we trace it to mosquitoes that infested the area. But then, they called it most often simply ague, and blamed it on the miasma, the humid, foggy haze that hung over the swamp most of the summer, made all the more obnoxious by the pall of smoke that forever filled the air, coming from smudge pots, burning logs, and home fires. The disease consisted of two entirely contradictory phases. One, the ague part, would cause a person to become chilled to the point of shaking. Victims claimed they could feel a shake coming on, usually every other day during the season, and with such regularity that farmers would plan to come in off the fields at a certain hour to lay down and take their shake. Others reported whole families shaking so badly that no one could hand another a drink of water. Some even said their whole houses shook when the family got to shaking so violently. The other part of the disease, the fever part, would come on just as abruptly as the shakes and with the same regularity, causing the person to burn with heat, shed clothes, consume vast amounts of water, and sweat enormously. The perspiration gave off a distinctive, offensive odor that was quickly recognized by anyone entering the cabin where an ague victim suffered. After the fever was over, the person would have a ravenous appetite, but for sometimes unusual foods which she or he would consume in vast quantities, like pickles or sauerkraut, milk, molasses, fruits. Lots of medicines were tried to cure the ague. Dr. Eccles' blood tonic, Dr. White's chill tonic, and others. But only quinine turned out to be not a cure, but an effective preventative treatment. And throughout the swamp, 3 condiments graced the eating table in every household: salt, pepper, and quinine. You sprinkled the quinine on your food before you ate it, or you took a heaping knife blade full of it at the end of the meal. The eventual remedy for fever and ague was discovered inadvertently during the 1850s, when a cholera epidemic struck many towns in the Black Swamp. Here in Eagleville, for example, in 1852, whole families were wiped out by cholera. These 6 tombstones are for the children of one family, ages 13 down to 1. They all died within a week of each other. In Gilboa, the carnage was so great and so quick that a mass grave was used to bury the dead, almost half the population of the small village. Well, some towns disappeared entirely, like Providence across the river from Grand Rapids. Unsure what had caused the cholera epidemic, the people blamed it on the standing water in the undrained lands and on the miasma associated with the swamp. Well, in 1859, the Ohio legislature passed the first ditch law designed to drain the swamp of standing water. Removing the standing water, of course, eliminated the breeding grounds of mosquitoes, the carriers of fever and ague. In a very short time, the disease diminished, becoming less and less of a burden to the people who settled here. Deep ditch drainage also caused people's wells to go dry. Wells that were often little more than cisterns for local drainage water. Drilling deeper wells created a purer water supply, less likely to be infested with fecal matter from nearby sewage systems and barnyards, and hence less likely to carry infectious diseases like cholera. The most important benefit of the 1859 ditch law, however, was that it created an orderly means of people working together to drain the swamp for the benefit of all. It was an odd period of rugged individualism, of rapaciousness and greed, where doing something cooperatively for the benefit of the entire community was the last thought on anyone's mind, was even an evil thought in some minds. That's not to say that people didn't come together in cooperative efforts like barn raisings, corn husking bees, or threshing rings, but these acts of cooperation always benefited a single individual who paid back the help in later cooperative acts for someone else's benefit. People seldom, if ever, cooperated for the benefit of the community, apart from individuals. And even if farmers and settlers wanted to join together in a common ditching effort for the community benefit, they couldn't have done it because of the limitations of township and county laws. It required a state law and a whole new way of looking at drainage problems as a regional one, not as an individual one. Until the law was passed, one person would simply drain his property into adjacent lands. A custom that worked well as long as the adjacent lands were wilderness. But when the adjacent lands were settled, the custom created problems, especially when a new neighbor drained his or her lands back onto your property, having no other place to send the water. The new ditch laws provided for ditches deep enough and located strategically enough to drain the entire lake plain into nearby rivers and thence into Lake Erie. People didn't like the idea of paying taxes for these improvements, nor did they like the state telling them what to do with their property. But they learned to accept these things as the cost of the land and of living in a swamp. In subsequent decades, more ditch laws were passed that provided for establishing river channels through formerly inundated areas, for extending river watersheds into formerly swamped areas, creating artificial headwaters for many of the rivers, actually creating the rivers in places they had never extended into. Even for cutting off the headwaters of sluggish streams like the Portage, channeling them into more direct rapid routes to Lake Erie, as the Jackson Cutoff does here in Custer in Wood County. These extensive efforts to drain the swamp were augmented by two further developments. The first being the introduction of clay field tile into the drainage system. Around 1870, it was discovered that the clay underlying the muck of the swamp was perfect for making fired clay tile. The art of making clay tile was brought to this country with immigrants from northern Germany and the Netherlands, where farmers had a long tradition of tiling fields for lowland drainage. The first tiles were horseshoe-shaped and laid in the ditch upside down as the inverted V boards had been placed before. Later, the open end of the horseshoe was filled in, making a round tile with one flat surface used as the bottom. Finally, the familiar round tile was developed. Clay tile was expensive to make compared to the former wooden tile systems, but not as expensive as one would think. Clay was obtained easily and cheaply close to the tile mill site. Wood used for fuel was easily procured from the ongoing clearing of the forest. and labor was readily available during the non-peak farming periods. Between 1870 and 1880, the number of tile factories in Northwest Ohio increased from 5 to over 50 as farmers learned the long-term value of underground tiling. The other major development was the successful building of railroads through the area. As late as 1860, there were still only 2 railroads that traversed the swamp. But by 1886, the area was crisscrossed by dozens of lines. After the Ohio Railroad fiasco, later attempts to build railroads in the area relied on very small, light engines and on corduroyed roadbeds to support the tracks. Tracks were often made of elm with iron straps on top to avoid wear and hold the rails together. The locomotives and cars were mainly used for industrial purposes, lumbering. The lengths of track were short and temporary, easily picked up and moved to another location. Such railroads were little more than small steam engines on wheels, much like the later steam threshing machines. After 1860, as ditching drained more areas of the swamp, larger machines could be employed on tracks laid in what has become the conventional manner of stone beds, ties, and iron rails, with the exception of the extensive drainage systems and culverts under the track bed, which were patterned on the ideas of the successfully rebuilt Maumee Western Reserve Road. The railroads thus contributed greatly to the overall effort to drain the swamp. All of this was a very costly way to obtain good farmland. And if the land had not been so seemingly cheap in the first place and its productivity so high after successful drainage, the effort would have hardly been worthwhile. One thing became clear from the start, that any farming done here would have to be done on a heroic scale, comparable to the heroic task it took to clear the swamp. Large tracts of land, requiring large amounts of horsepower, manpower, and woman power to cultivate. Those who endured the hardships and setbacks of the first settlements survived to see their farms and families increase. They fought a valiant battle against the swamp, and the swamp left its toll on them, weathered, rough-hewn, unvarnished people. But they won. The great black swamp is no more. Or is it? When it rains in Northwest Ohio, the old swamp returns, more as a lake than a swamp, reminding everyone that this place was once a glacial lake. Even when it looks as though there's very little water standing in the fields, if you fly over the area, it looks like the entire place is underwater. The city of Bowling Green, being the only major town in the swamp, has had to learn to deal with flooding problems. It has dug large holding ponds and massive underground cisterns to give the rainwater a place to go. Later, these holding tanks are pumped out to the rivers when the floodwaters recede enough to accommodate more water. All of this is costly, but it keeps the swamp away for a while. Farmers in Northwest Ohio find a beauty in all this flatness. Some confess to bewilderment as to why anyone would ever want to go through the trouble to farm on the side of a hill, or to not being able to see the end of a row a mile down the field. They love straightness. I've heard farmers talk with vivid consternation about trying to negotiate a curving road on the side of a West Virginia mountain. And although most farmers here keep a few acres of land in trees as a woodlot and as hunting preserves, the ugliest thing they see is a tree in a drainage ditch or fallen across a stream. They attack this ugliness with the old vengeance of the pioneers, returning the land to flatness once again. There's no doubt in my mind that at some point in the future, the farmers in this area, along with the Army Corps of Engineers, will cement in the streams and ditches of Northwest Ohio, much as the Corps has done with the rivers and streams of Southern California and other places in the West. For what we tend to forget in looking at this flat land is that we're looking at a machine, not a garden. And the people who farm this land are more like manufacturers than yeoman tillers of the soil. As manufacturers, they treat their machine with a great deal of respect, keeping it in good repair, preventing abuse, using it efficiently and sparingly. But as manufacturers, they do not partake of the same sense of stewardship that farming has traditionally upheld. Instead, they look at land as something that was built, a carefully engineered machine designed to produce commodities for the marketplace. Perhaps that is the ultimate price the people paid in conquering the Black Swamp. It took such a massive, inhuman effort that people could not afford the luxury of community with the soil, of integrating their lives with it, of becoming a part of it. Despite the long hours of toil at farming, there's always a distance between the farmer and the land. All of which makes us wonder whether the Black Swamp was ever really conquered, or whether it was only transformed into another kind of alien environment.